New England IPA is a relatively new style of beer that some thought would die out fairly quickly, though it appears to be maintaining its popularity among hophead craft beer lovers and homebrewers. Unique in many respects, there are various aspects to brewing NEIPA that are believed to contribute to its hazy appearance, juicy flavor, and pillowy mouthfeel. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and on this episode, contributor Brian Hall, lover of all things hazy, is with me to talk about the role yeast plays in crafting delicious versions of this style.
Well, we've talked about water, we've talked about malt, we've talked about different types of hops. It's time we finally tackle yeast. So today we're going to talk about the different yeast strains that are used to create that pillowy, juicy, hazy love that is flooding the country. And I will say I'm a lover of things hazy, but not all things hazy.
Well, I mean, let's be real. I think you and I were just actually having a little bit of a tiff back and forth about the haze craze. It's commonly said that brewers make wort while yeast make beer, and it makes sense to me that a style like NEIPA, which is very, very unique, I think, might demand a different type of yeast than, say, other types of IPAs. So this ought to be a good one. But before we get into that, I want to remind everyone out there who might live around any of us to reach out so that we can get you involved as a participant. We've got contributors all the way up in Anchorage, Alaska, Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Auburn, New York, Atlanta, Georgia, and right here in Fresno, California. You can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I'll connect you with the contributor closest to you. If you like what we're doing and you want to help us to keep doing it, you can head over to brewlosophy.com/support and use the links you find there when you do your online shopping. You can also receive rewards in return for your support by becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Rewards include cool things like access to the Brew Crew private forum, unpublished recipes, and discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com. Our patrons actually got $8 off a pound of the new Sabro hop this month. I thought that was a pretty cool little deal. For a pledge of just $3 a month, you'll be invited to attend a monthly live Q&A session with awesome people. Just last week, Dr. Charlie Bamforth from the UC Davis Brewing Program hit patrons with some seriously awesome brewing wisdom. It was amazing. Coming up in the next few months, we've got Vinny Chilurzo from the Russian River Brewing Company, Annie Johnson from Pico Brew, and John Kimmich from The Alchemist. They're all going to be taking questions from patrons. In addition to all of that, patrons pledging at the $5 level or higher are entered into a monthly drawing for a $50 gift certificate from our friends at lovetobrew.com. Again, you can learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Okay, feedback this week is brought to you by Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch and have a bunch of awesome strains to choose from. Probably my all-time favorite right now is their L17 Harvest. I talk about it all the time. It's a lager strain that I found works really well fermented at L temperatures, and I'm really excited to try out their new A43 Loki strain that has a super wide temperature range as well. Go check out all they have to offer at imperialyeast.com and snag some for yourself at More Beer and Great Fermentations. So we got a ton of feedback on our recent episodes covering bias and beer evaluation, which was really encouraging since we really like talking about that and have already started planning more shows along those lines. So listener Brian Ellis wrote in to say, he goes, I was thinking about the topic as I was finishing up the second episode this morning on my drive into work. You guys talked about the five senses and the impacts on one influencing the other. I wonder if there was a collective group of local hearing or sight-impaired craft beer fans that'd be willing to participate in a sensory panel or triangle test. This may be inspired by recently finishing Daredevil Season 3, which I have to admit I haven't seen, which is probably insulting to those communities, but no malice is intended. I was just thinking about how the common belief is a heightening of the remaining senses when loss of another occurs. It'd be fascinating to see their sensory analysis and what types of descriptors they identify with the theory of heightened senses, but also no preconceived bias regarding color for the visually impaired specifically. I think that's a really interesting thought, and I don't think that was offensive at all. He's posing a question, he's something he's curious about. I've definitely heard of this phenomenon, but I don't really have any clue how it impacts beer evaluation. Brian, what do you think, man?
Yeah, I don't have any experience with that either, and I don't think it was an offensive question in the slightest. I think it's really interesting, and I kind of wonder what would be the difference between someone who may have been seeing or hearing impaired their entire life versus someone that we just put a blindfold on and see, because like if there is actually a heightened sense, it would be interesting to see what a panel of blind tasters in the sense of not being able to actually see would smell and taste, as opposed to some people that are just blindfolded versus people that can see the beer.
Yeah. Well, and I like the idea of what types of descriptors are they going to use as like compared to what somebody who has all of their senses, I guess, it's an interesting question. Something that I definitely, I don't really have access to a large group of people that I'm aware of who are craft beer fans who have some sort of sensory impairment. So if anyone out there who's listening to this, or who reads our stuff regularly does and wants to do something, I think it'd be interesting. So thanks for the feedback. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brulosophy.com or leave us a voice message by calling 951-444-0320. So if I had to choose a single style of beer to drink for the rest of my life, it would be Pilsner, hands down. And I brew a lot of it, usually using pretty standard ingredients. One thing I've never considered using in this style is rye, but I recently received a beer from homebrewer Justin Lee that he calls Hoppy Rye Pils that has 10% rye malt in the grist and an arguably non-traditional hop schedule.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Another beer. That's clear. Hey, you got more than me. Sorry. Tastes and smells like nothing.
No smell.
Wow. Do you taste anything?
No.
I mean, it's good because it's smooth. Tastes great. No filling.
It's got some after going on.
No, I get nothing. I get nothing.
Yeah, it's kind of plain.
It's like, when you get like water. Remember when it was all the craze when you get water and you would squirt like the artificial flavoring in it, and now it became like grape flavored water?
Yeah.
I feel like this is water and someone squirted beer flavor and now it's like beer flavored water.
At the end, I get like the bitterness.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I mean,
yeah, it's not much.
We're not gonna go over the top. It's definitely beer.
Yeah, it's smooth.
It's definitely beer.
Maybe it's near beer.
Wouldn't that be something?
I have no idea what it is, but that's not surprising.
What if it's like amazing beer and we're idiots?
Well, we are idiots.
Doing that, we're going to be made to look like fools.
I drink it.
I would drink it too. I can taste that there's beer.
It's very plain.
It's just there's nothing.
I mean, no smell really.
No, there's a smell.
Yeah,
dude, we're too big for our britches. I would drink this.
Oh yeah.
Well, we both drank it also.
Yeah.
Based on that, I'm gonna give it 6 jerseys. That's a pretty high score too.
I was gonna go with 5. Yeah.
Yeah, for a total of 15.
I know it might seem like a dig at first, but the fact that the boys described the beer in such simple terms is a good thing. Trust me, it means that they actually liked it. And so did I, quite a bit. I got a really nice bready malt character, no spice. This whole thing about like rye imparting a spiciness, I'm learning that may not necessarily be the case. But to my palate, the rye, I do think kind of contributed to a really nice mouthfeel in the beer. It was just all around really, really well made. I'm not sure of all of the other process stuff that Justin did to make this beer, but I'll definitely be playing around with rye malt in future batches of Pilsner that I make. You ever done anything like that?
Never with Pilsner. I try to keep my Pilsners as clean as possible. I've added rye to stouts and that sort of thing, and felt like I've noticed a character, but never do a light beer. It's interesting. I'll have to try it out sometime.
Yeah. I made a 20%. Rye, or I think it was 30% rye malt pale ale a few years ago. It was absolutely delicious, but a pain in my ass. That was back when I was doing kind of traditional batch sparge. Whew.
Oh, it sticks up like crazy. I mean, we did a 40-gallon batch of stout. And we put, I think it was just 10% rye. And it was probably everything else that was contributing as well. But man, that thing, we had to de-stick that twice. So rye can be sticky. If you use rye, the only thing I have to say is add rice hulls.
Yeah. Well, I did that as well. I added like a pound of rice hulls and it didn't help at all. But now I just use a bag and I don't have to worry about it. But well, thanks for the idea, Justin. Like I said, I do plan on messing around with rye malt in future batches of Pilsner because your beer was very inspiring and delicious. If you want your beer or any other fermented beverage you make reviewed by the guys, you can email me, marshall@brulosophy.com, and I'll get you all set up. All right, we'll be right back. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brulosophy sent you.
Hi, I'm Stephen Leash, creator of Brow Supply Brewing Systems, here to tell you about our latest Unibrow brewing system. Modeled after the brew-in-a-bag method, the Unibrow uses the same kettle for both mashing and boiling, replacing the fabric bag with a stainless basket that can hold up to 20 pounds of grain. A heating element is run by an electric controller that allows for the maintenance of specific mash temperatures and makes mashing easier than ever. Each Unibrow is shipped with a counterflow chiller and the parts required to brew a batch of beer. We're really proud of the Unibrow, and we know you'll love it as much as we do. Go check it out at browsupply.com and sign up for our email list to receive special deals in your inbox.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. When I really got into making my own beer, there were a few basic yeast strains I would go with based on the region where the style that I was making originated from. So for hoppy American ales, that almost always meant some form of the very popular Chico strain, which is known for producing a very clean fermentation character that allows the hops and to some degree, I guess, the malt to kind of shine through. Very low fermentation character. Well, as New England IPA blasted onto the scene, I noticed things were a little bit different. Brian, you've been brewing this style for as long as I've known you, and you got your start while living in the New England area. So what's this whole thing about with using different yeast strains?
Well, with New England IPA, it kind of started with the idea of culturing the heady topper yeast, which is known as the Conan yeast. After that kind of lit up the scene, people started really getting into the yeast that was going into their New England IPAs, as well as I think their regular IPAs. I think New England IPAs, its reach has extended to the regular IPA realm as far as hopping techniques with packing in additional hop flavors and thoughts about water and yeast and that sort of thing. At least it has for me. So if we take a look at like historical IPA, I mean historical IPA, back in the 1700s, there wasn't any microbiology really going on. So we're looking at probably Brettanomyces, Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, things that you wouldn't normally think about in an IPA. And that kind of, as microbiology became more of a science, people started paying more attention to it in the 1800s and 1900s. They found that old IPAs could be cultured up and still had Brettanomyces in them. Right. And then that sort of went to more where our current approach is, and that's like we should have a neutral ale yeast that minimizes esters, diacetyl, and sulfur. Nothing that we want to have interfere with our hops. Yeah. And that feels like it's got to be sort of in the grand scheme of things, kind of a relatively new development, this idea. And I'm going to, as far as I know, this was driven quite, strongly by Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, what with their kind of the invention of their green label pale ale. This focus just on hop character and how that grew, over the 80s and 90s into this, in basically the phenomenon that it is today. But what America is known for are these clean, crisp, clear IPAs. And that is not what the New England IPA is all about. My understanding is that, and maybe, I know you've talked with John Kimmich from The Alchemist a little bit, so maybe you can speak to this even better than I can. But my understanding is that Conan, which we don't know very much about, was at the very least, has, at least in its lineage, is kind of like English in origin. Yes, the Conan strain supposedly came from Greg Noonan's Vermont Pub and Brewery in Burlington, where John Kimmich used to work before starting The Alchemist. And he calls this Vermont, like, I think it's VPB 1988, because that's when he was using it. So that's kind of the origins of Conan. And he says, and I'm quoting him here, he says, "The heart of the beer is my private strain of Conan Ale yeast. It produces the very distinct apricot and tropical fruit esters, but you have to know how to handle it and how to draw the character out." And then he goes on talking about saying it took him years of tweaking to get the age and the generation of the Conan yeast just right, so it would produce the flavor that he was looking for.
So the idea there, again, kind of my understanding, a little bit of presumption, I'll admit, is that rather than saying we're going to let all of the character in this beer be from the hops, it sounds like this idea kind of came up to rely on some of the esters that this particular yeast strain creates and use that in conjunction with the hops to kind of even push a unique but an even more fruity type of overall character of the beer. Right.
Yeah, he's using what most people tend to believe is more of an English ale yeast, right? I mean, American style yeast tend to have more of a cleaner profile, fewer phenols. But when we look at the English styles of yeast, we're looking at more estery characters, so a little bit more sweetness, which often, the descriptors you see they emphasize the maltier flavors that are in the beer.
Yeah.
Something like Fuller's, they have those fruity esters, and I imagine the thought being, if you can get any more fruity character out of any of the ingredients in your beer, that would boost the overall fruitiness that is being sought after in these New England IPAs. I know I've used small amounts of Vienna malt in some of my New England IPAs with the idea that if I can just get a little boost of sweetness, I can somehow support that overall fruity hop profile. So I think that's, I'm at least, looking at what he's saying here, that's probably what he's going for when he's talking about, trying to get this yeast exactly where he wants it to pull out these tropical fruit esters.
Right. Well, so just taking a little step back here, are we agreeing that Heady Topper was that was kind of the spark that lit the fire of New England IPA?
Yeah, I think Heady Topper and Hill Farmstead were the two big ones. Heady Topper obviously being the more famous and I think slightly more accessible, although I wasn't there right when it first started coming out. But I think those two were kind of the big ones. And interestingly enough, this is all kind of rumors that go around because a lot of these brewers won't release their super secrets.
Yeah.
But we've got the Conan strain on the Vermont Pub Heady Topper side of the world, and then over with Hill Farmstead, we've got the what is the Imperial Yeast Juice strain, or the London 3 strain, and which supposedly all comes from the Boddington strain.
Right.
So there's kind of these two big strains in the New England IPA world.
So before, and this is, I know people are probably going to wonder this. I know I do, at least. Before The Alchemist started, really pumping out Heady Topper, and it became this crazy, world-renowned, highly sought-after beer. The Conan strain, arguably, was really just kind of isolated to that one brewery that was using it. It wasn't used very often. I'm not aware of any labs that were selling it, before the Heady Topper craze. Now you can pretty much get what we're calling Conan. You can basically get it from any lab out there. Again, I believe Imperial calls that one Barbarian.
AO4 Barbarian.
That's
so
right.
Imperial Barbarian. You've got Burlington from White Labs. You've got Omega's, I don't know what they call it. East Coast Yeast has their ECY 29, their Northeast Ale. Giga has their Vermont Ale.
Yeah, I know the Yeast Bay has a version of it.
The Yeast Bay's got a version. I don't know what the Y Yeast equivalent is of that. I don't know if Y Yeast actually has
I don't think
one.
they do at this point. But no. Y Yeast does have, like you mentioned, they have their 1318 London Ale 3, which has been around for quite a while, actually. And the one thing that we're pretty certain of between those two, and in my experience, those are hands down the two most commonly used yeast strains for making New England IPA. But the one thing, the kind of the link between those is that they are both English in character. But what I was getting to was breweries who might be using these. You mentioned Hill Farmstead using 1318 from Yeast or the Boddington strain, which if you haven't had Boddingtons, go buy yourself some of those cans. It's a really good beer. But I've used 1318 before. In fact, I've used both Conan, variants of the Conan strain as well as the Boddington strain in styles that aren't IPA before, and it works out really well. The idea again being though that you can use the esters that purportedly are created using these more English oriented strains to balance out or to add to, I guess, contribute to that fruity character that you're going for in this style of beer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Hill Farmstead is more on the Hill Farmstead as well as Tired Hands. And this information I got from Ed Coffey, just straight up on his blog. He talks about the Tired Hands yeast, and he said he approached Gene from Tired Hands, who's the head brewer there, and he said he got his yeast from a quote friend in Vermont, but it is not the Conan strain. Huh. So supposedly, and I'm guessing Tired Hands is probably using the same one as Hill Farmstead. Ed says when he asked Gene about it, he asked Gene whether it came from Sean Hill. Gene deflected into a different topic. So it's possible that they're both using a version of London 3, which is obviously Imperial Juice, which is my personal favorite strain and the one that I use in all the experiments and all the New England IPAs that I make. Anecdotally, I've used Conan, and I didn't get the same balance in the beer that I thought that I got from the London Ale 3. Granted, this was 4 or 5 years ago, and this was back when. 4 or 5 years ago when you and I first started talking, Conan had just come out, and it was like, oh, so-and-so just got Conan in, or, I'm trying to get some Conan, or people talked about, I'm culturing this up from Hetty Topper and da-da-da-da-da. So,
oh, dude, I remember perusing the forums, and for a good while there, this is probably back in 2011, 2012, it was like, hey, who can get cans of this stuff and propagate the yeast from the bottom of the can, and people were sending out slants, and it was all. And now, you just go to your homebrew shop and it's there. But that's, that to me is this is a completely different topic. That's a power of homebrewers. We can do that. We can make this kind of stuff popular and allow it to become a bit more known, so that we have access to the stuff that we want. I think it's pretty cool. Another yeast that I believe also I read on Ales of the River Wards, Ed's blog is. And it was when he was making, if I'm not mistaken, he was making his Tired Hands clone. It was Safel SO4.
Yeah, actually, my first New England IPA-ish style was kind of a sip of sunshine, double sunshine, or a double sunshine clone from Lawson's Finest Liquids. And I actually used a combination of SO4 and SO5, and the beer came out very drinkable. I haven't used SO4 since for any of my beers, just because I fell in love with the London 3.
Yeah.
But that beer was brewed probably 2012, and so I can't give you exact tasting notes on it. It tasted very fresh. It tasted good. It wasn't quite the New England IPA that we know today, with the characteristics and sometimes milky appearance, but it was definitely a good beer. But that could have also been because we put 7 pounds of hops into it. So
yeah, that'll make pretty much any beer at least palatable. So SO4 is, I've had some experience with this yeast. These days I only use it for making cider, and even then I'm usually sticking to Belle Saison. To me, SO4, it kind of imparts beer, and I'm not dogging on it. People enjoy this. That's totally cool. But it kind of imparts this weird kind of tartness to beer. And the one time I tried making an IPA with it, it just came out even stronger, that characteristic that I'm not a big fan of. So I've stopped using it, but I've heard really good things about it. And I forget if the experiment that Ed did with us a couple of years ago, the gelatin finding a New England IPA, which really ruffled some feathers. But I forget if he used SO4 for that. And if he did, that beer was fantastic. So it could be, and it could just be that there's certain methods to using yeast when making this style of beer that make it work out even better. You mentioned blends, and this is a thing that I've been seeing. I think it's becoming more and more popular right now in terms of making New England IPA specifically. But you look at like Imperial, they have their citrus, which is a blend. If I'm not mistaken, that's a blend of basically specifically their Sactois and either Juice or Conan strains.
Yeah, I know they have that blend. It's one of those ones I've been trying to find an experiment to line up to use with it. It sounds like a really interesting strain, but I haven't used it. I haven't tried blending any of my other strains together for New England IPAs. Like I said, I'm kind of a London 3 fanboy in the same way I'm a Citra fanboy, and been sticking with what works. So I think it'd be fun to try that out. I also think it'd be interesting to try, just going off the top of my head here, it'd be interesting to try a blend of doing a London 3 as well as a Conan style strain.
So blending like the Conan with juice, basically.
So barbarian juice, I guess is what you could call that one.
Juicy barbarian.
Juicy barbarian.
Oh, well, it seems pretty obvious to me that yeast, there are those people out there, and I got to admit, I haven't seen this in a while, but there are those people out there who will post a recipe or something, to a forum and say, hey, this is one of the best New England IPAs I've made. And you look at it and it's they've done really no different than what, you might do with a standard West Coast IPA, and they use SO5, USO5 or some Chico variant of yeast. And I'm looking at this going, well, it's not just, you can't call it a New England IPA just because it's hazy. I mean, so it seems.
Oh, don't get me started.
I know, I had to do it, but to me, it seems like if you're gonna make this style and you're gonna define it as its own thing and kind of try to have it be this unique style, then it's got to be different. And one of the things, in my opinion, that makes it different, and I'm kind of siding with you on this, Brian, but the haze.
I'm all ears.
I'm not giving all the way in though. Don't even. But the haze is a function of the methodology. It's a function of the recipe or the ingredients that are used in that recipe, and it's not what defines the style. With that, I mean, and to me, I feel like that in my experience as brewing it, and in most of the versions of this beer that I've been able to drink some of, that yeast character actually plays a role in that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you in that. And actually, it brings me to the next point that I was just going to mention here. And 2 years ago, I gave a presentation called "My Milkshake Brings All the Boys to the Yard" about New England IPAs with Malcolm Fraser and Scott Janish. And I corresponded with John Kimmich ahead of time just to kind of, and I tried to speak with some other brewers, but he was the one that got back to me the best. And so I asked him a lot about what he thought. One of the things I asked him, I said, hey, what are your thoughts on an American ale yeast or a more expressive yeast? And this, he talks about his Vermont Pub and Brewery, the 1988 strain that he's been doing it. And he talks about how since he's been using his yeast in his cans, obviously his beer isn't filtered, so there's yeast sitting at the bottom of the cans. He tries to get it out fresh, so a lot of people think that this yeast is fresh. And his thought, and this is just his thought, he says, quote, "It has been cultured by and sold by various yeast labs under the names. However, the labs have all cultured from our cans, which happen to be the weakest of the weak cells that if they make it into the can. And if that's their starting point, and the beers brewed with those cultures tend to give an extremely milky appearance to the beers fermented with it. And he says, I think this is partly the cause for a lot of super murky IPAs being produced. Some of them will never drop bright as they age in the fridge. Even the cloudiest of Hefeweizens will eventually drop bright after a few weeks of refrigeration. He's had some that sit in his fridge for a month and still retain that milky appearance. And then he goes on to speculate that maybe they're using some other sort of weird ingredients to achieve this. So, I mean, he goes off on a little tangent there about people using his yeast. I think he is, he's in the camp that you do want to use some sort of expressive, probably some sort of English yeast. Obviously he's got his favorite culture. But then he also goes on to, say that maybe some of the excessive haze that we're seeing is from some of the subsequent or generations or using weak cells. I don't know how much that would actually affect the haze personally, but
wouldn't it be funny if the haze in the New England IPA style was a mistake? That would be so funny. Like
if it all came from people trying to get heady topper yeast.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's supposed to be hazy. Well, I'll be honest. I mean, when my brother, who lives out east, he lives in Buffalo, New York, and he was able to get some heady topper that had been canned like 4 days prior. He had a friend who went to Vermont, and so he sent me one. He overnighted me a can. This was almost, this had to have been 6 years ago now, because he sent it to me right around Christmas time. And I remember, I have decent access to Pliny the Elder out here. And so that was the big competition back then, was like Pliny versus Heady. Which one's better? What side are you going to take? And I remember pouring out that can of Heady Topper and just being kind of aghast at how incredibly milky it looked. I mean, it was so hazy. And now to see how far things have come in terms of acceptance of that appearance.
It's
crazy.
I feel like Heady Topper looks, like about the same as like some of these dry hop pilsners sometimes you see that are slightly hazy. I mean, it seems like almost nothing compared to some of the milkshakes that you see coming out of other different breweries.
Yeah.
And, Heady Topper will clear up if you let it sit in the fridge for 2 to 3 weeks. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but eventually it will clear up and it will fall out. Whereas, you've got some of these other ones where, the brewers are trying to impart this haze because it is such the signature. And if people are thinking they're going to drink a hazy beer and they pull something out that's 3 weeks old and it pulls out clear, they're not going to think they're getting the experience.
I guess so.
Yeah. Which is too bad, because as you know, my whole thing on that is it is a byproduct. It's not something we should strive for. But that's a whole nother episode that I think we've already done.
Well, and I know this. We're kind of getting a little bit away from yeast talk here, but I do think that if you're okay, so what would, and this is a hypothetical because we have tried so hard to produce a New England IPA that's crystal clear, and it is very difficult to do. And by that, what I mean is that we are engaging in all of the processes that people say are necessary to make a New England IPA, because you take that stuff away, and the truth is you're just making an IPA. There's nothing different about the recipe in general except for the use of flaked adjunct. Okay, that's unique to New England IPA. We'll use an English yeast. Don't use an American. Okay, that's unique to New England IPA. We talked about biotransformation dry hopping, which is a very questionable practice nowadays, but that's unique to New England IPA. So I don't know. I think it matters. I do think that the yeast plays a role, but I wanted to test it out for myself, and that's exactly what we did. We're going to be getting into the results from those experiments as soon as we're back from this break. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewer's Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, do you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge, and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the super fast counterflow chiller, the exGEERator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to grainfather.com, that's grainfather.com, and get started today.
So, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of people view Heady Topper from The Alchemist as being the spark that started the NEIPA fire. Not long after that beer gained popularity, Yeast Labs started selling versions of their quote-unquote Conan yeast, which, as we mentioned before, we know very little about, other than the fact that it seems to have English origins. Of course, the other very popular yeast is the strain sourced from Boddington's, which Yeast sells as 1318 London Ale 3. That's Imperial's juice. Well, a while back, my buddy from House of Pendragon Brewing Company, Tommy Caprellian, was getting into the haze game and was curious of any differences between these yeasts. So naturally, we collaborated on a very interesting experiment to compare these two yeasts. Basically, what he did is he brewed up a 45-gallon batch of New England IPA, super basic recipe, 80% pale malt, 20% flaked oats. I think that worked for this. You can get full recipe details over on this experiment article at brewlosophy.com, but suffice to say he used standard NEIPA brewing methods. The wort was then split between two identical fermenters post-boil and pitched with equal amounts of either Yeast 1318 London Ale 3 yeast or Giga Yeast 054 Vermont Ale yeast. I think the only real difference that they found was that 1318 finished at like 1012 FG while the Vermont Ale finished at 1010. So not a huge difference, but kind of interesting to me. Once the beers were done, they were kegged up and brought to the House of Pendragon tap room right here in Clovis, which I'm lucky enough to have as my local watering hole, seeing as it's a block away from my house. And we collected data during one afternoon with anyone who was willing to drink some free beer. The results, I thought, were pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they got an amazing 75 participants. If I could just get half that, I'd be thrilled.
You need to own a tap room, Brian. That's
working on it. To be significant, 33 people would have needed to identify the odd beer out. However, 28 people were only able to identify the odd beer out. And, at that point, it could have just been, it's close enough. It could have been guessing. That's just about probability. So you were there. What did you think?
Yeah, I was there. And I was serving most of these and we're talking, 75 people. That was a nice long afternoon. But the interesting thing to me was that I'm very neurotic when it comes to data collection, so I wasn't allowing anybody to talk to each other. I was catching people before they even had their first beer, so they weren't drunk, when they were doing the triangle. People were focusing really hard. As I'm sure you've witnessed, a lot of people kind of have a sense of pride in their ability to get these things right, which makes no sense to me, but it is what it is.
You know me. We just use the raise of hands method, right?
I say all of that because I want people to know with this one that I don't mean to stray off too far into like trying to justify what it is we're doing, but 75 people, that's a huge sample size. It's big, and this still didn't reach significance despite the fact that these yeasts are different. They were different. I mean, they're from different sources. They're used by different breweries, and yet people could not, with any confidence, could not distinguish the beer the New England IPA fermented with the London Ale 3 strain from the one fermented with the popular Conan strain, which I don't know about you, Brian, but I feel like those two produce a difference. They come in different packages at the very least.
I've never done a side by side, so everything I'm going off of is just I brewed one beer. This is how I thought it tasted. I brewed another beer. This is how I thought it tasted.
Oh yeah.
And, unless you do an experiment side by side, that's really how all of it is. The only other person I know that's done a side by side whose opinion I value is Scott Janish, and he didn't do a triangle test, so this is just his opinion, but he did 1318 versus Giga Yeast 054, and he got what I was mentioning earlier, and I feel that I pick up the softness more in the London 3. He says that he thought the hop intensity was slightly more from the Conan style yeast than from the Boddington strain. And I like how he kind of gives us updates later, but because his update is after doing this multiple times, he says he prefers 1318. He says he gets inconsistent results with the Vermont strain, and sometimes loses those fruity esters.
Yeah.
So, just anecdotally, his experience as well, but he's one of the only other people I know that have done the side-by-side comparison.
Yeah.
But he does say how they are very, very similar. You've got two supposedly English strains in a heavily hopped beer. It doesn't come. I wouldn't say it comes as a surprise to me that people weren't able to pick that out.
Yeah. Had these been served when we do these triangle tests, we serve the beers in the triangle in 3 different colored opaque cups, basically. So you can't use appearance to try to help distinguish the beers. But the one that was fermented with the Vermont ale strain or the Conan strain was ever so slightly clearer than the one fermented with 1318. Not by much. I mean, if you weren't really looking hard, you probably wouldn't have noticed that they were a little bit different in appearance. But like you said, I do think I wonder to what extent the fact that there's just so much hops thrown at these beers that and both of those strains are English origin. They both ostensibly produce esters and probably fairly similar types of esters, that the hop character just kind of blasted out any differences that might actually exist. People often wonder about our impressions on these experiments. And so in this one, I had one of the Pendragon staff folks, serve me 5 separate blind triangle tests for me to try. And out of those 5, I was amazingly unsuccessful. And I identified the odd beer out, an entire one time. To me, they tasted exactly the same, which again, this is someone who has played with both of those yeast numerous times prior to this experiment and felt like, I felt like they were different in some way. And they are. I mean, they're different strains. We can say that. But the beers next to each other even just tasted exactly the same. It was pretty shocking. Since this experiment, in fact, a buddy of mine brewed a split batch New England IPA homebrewed and fermented one with the Juice and then another one with Imperial's Barbarian. And we kind of had a similar experience where, drinking them at his house, right off the tap, we're like, oh, this one tastes like this one tastes like that. But then, we wouldn't be able to tell a difference if you were to serve us 2 pints, one after the other. I wouldn't be able to tell if you'd changed them up on me or not. They tasted very similar.
Right. So we've got these 2 English strains, which, come back as not being significant. People saying, okay, these English strains taste very similar. So maybe the next step would be to take a look at, kind of the East Coast yeast versus the West Coast yeast. But before we do that, I want to remind everyone about Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for the home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices and super fast shipping. They also carry everything needed for total electric brewery automation. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com.
So as NEIPA began to grow in popularity, which really wasn't that long ago at all, relative to the grand scheme of things, in terms of beer in general, I quickly became convinced that the yeast strain one used is very important. This wasn't based on personal experience, but rather deference to people like Brian, who were brewing this style all the time, as well as Ed Coffey and Scott Janish and Michael Tonsmeyer, people who I feel like really did kind of push this style into the spotlight. However, every once in a while, I'd see a recipe online, like I mentioned before, that included a yeast like the Chico strain, something like WLP 001 or Y Yeast 1056, which made me curious enough to test it out for myself. So as most people out there who follow what we do at Brewlosophy know, I am not the biggest fan of New England IPA, but I like to give everything its fair shake. And I don't think there's anything wrong with having different preferences. But anyways, I brewed up a 10-gallon batch of New England IPA wort. This was 88% pale malt and 12% flaked oats. Very simple. I split that wort between 2 identical fermentation vessels post-boil, and then I pitched a starter of Yeast 1318 London Ale 3 into one batch and a starter of Yeast 1056, I think that's their American ale, into the other one. So you've got Boddington's, a very traditional New England IPA yeast strain, and then you've got Chico, the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale strain. Fermentation activity was identical between the batches. Based on my observation, they looked exactly the same, which I honestly didn't really expect based on my experience using both of these yeast prior to this experiment. In the end, the 1318 beer finished at 1015 FG. Brian, is that a pretty typical finishing gravity for a New England IPA?
Mine tend to finish right around between 10, 12 and 10, 14. So I would say 10, 15 is right in the ballpark.
Okay, so but a little bit higher than the one that was fermented with 1056, which finished at 1009. I mean, that to me, it may not, again, be huge, but it was notable. I thought it was really interesting. Especially odd considering Yeast lists the attenuation for 1318 as being something like 71 to 75%, while 1056 is expected to get less than that, 60 to 72%. So something about these yeast strains and the way they were used, at least, changed the attenuation. I think that was pretty interesting.
I mean, there's something going on, because if you look at the flocculation characteristics, I mean, 1318 is supposed to be an excellent flocculator.
Yeah.
But yet we're seeing it being actually seems to produce more haze than some of the other ones that may or may not have as high flocculation properties. So there's a lot of interesting things at play here.
Yeah, that is something. That's something I've thought a lot about, is that, and it doesn't seem to get that much talk, is that English strains are known for being, strong flocculators and clumping up and, creating egg drop soup during fermentation. And yet they are what's used to create these super hazy beers. I think that's kind of an interesting. The batch fermented with 1318 in the end, when these beers were kegged up and treated exactly the same. And once they were carbonated, the batch treated with or fermented with 1318 was slightly darker and a little bit more clear than the 1056 batch. Which
there you go.
Yeah, I know. So it wasn't a huge difference, but they did look different, and I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, in my experience using the Chico strain, regardless of where it comes from, it is not a great flocculator. But if you're not finding the beers, then 1056 can take quite a while to clear up. So that, I guess, that didn't surprise me too much. I was a little surprised that the 1318 batch of New England IPA wasn't as hazy as I expected, or at the very least as hazy as past batches that I'd made using that yeast.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I could think of is you've got 12% oats instead of usually standard's 20, so maybe less oats, less haze. I don't know.
Yeah, something like that.
Just a thought.
So, so these beers are done, and I decided to serve them to some participants, see if they were able to distinguish them. And I was able to get 21 people to take the triangle test, out of which 12 would have to identify the odd beer out in order for us to say that the beers were significantly different. And that's exactly how many did. 12 people were able to identify the 1318 fermented New England IPA from the one that was fermented with 1056. So we could say that these beers were reliably distinguishable. Is this surprising to you, Brian?
No, not surprising.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah, sorry to be so blunt, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, you've got two totally different yeasts. You've got a pretty significant final gravity difference, which, I realize in the past experiments have shown that people aren't able to pick up on that. But I think, when you've got the flavor profile combined with the different FGs, I think, small things build up to be big things. So
yeah.
Doesn't surprise me.
Well, yeah. And, to me, so people are going to point out the FG difference, well, that's probably what it was. But we've done a ton of experiments that seems to suggest that final gravity does not really have all that big of an impact on perceptible characteristics of beer. What I mean by that is you can mash, we've done this a few times, you can mash a beer at 148 and mash a beer at 162, and they are going to attenuate differently. One is good, that higher mash temp is going to produce a beer with less alcohol and a higher finishing gravity, predictably. Those beers, though, if they are otherwise identical, made using the same recipes, will more than likely be indistinguishable. We've done this a lot, and it's shocking to me still till this day, but that does seem to be the case. So I don't think that the FG difference is what made these beers.
No, I don't think it's what made it, but I think it could have contributed to a characteristic that people picked up on. So like, again, small parts leading up to an overall impression.
Yeah. Well, I had these beers on tap, and to me, it was sort of what you'd expect, I guess, which I guess, that makes some sense, right? My expectations. But I was able to, just to get it out there, I did numerous triangle tests with this one and was consistently and confidently able to identify the odd beer out. To me, the beer fermented with Yeast 1318 just had more character to it. To me, I hate to say it.
Say it.
It was a little bit more juicy.
Was it juicy?
God. But it was though. It had this. It seemed like, and again, I was biased as hell. I get that.
Right.
But to me, it was like the esters really did serve to amplify that fruity hop character. And the Yeast 1056 beer, on the other hand, it was just cleaner and had kind of a more recognizable hoppy characteristic. And by that, I mean, not the fruity stuff that you get from hops, but when you open a bag of fresh hops and it just has that kind of green hop character, that's what it had, and that's sort of what I expect in more of a West Coast style IPA. I want it to smell like I'm on the hop field, whereas these New England IPAs, I don't typically get that. I do get more of this interesting blend of juicy hoppiness. God, I hate saying that, but like this fruit juicy thing going on. And so, I thought my impressions of the 1056 beer, I thought it was kind of interesting that I perceived it that way, given the difference or the high chloride to sulfate ratio, because, in my experience brewing IPA using that Chico strain, you're usually kind of, heavy on the sulfate, not so heavy on the chloride, but yeah, that was my experience with it. I was able to tell these things apart. The 12 out of 21 of our tasters was able to tell them apart, which left me pretty convinced again that this idea that I have that New England IPA sort of demands a certain style of yeast, which I know is going to get some people riled up out there, but I really do think it does. I think these English strains really do work well with this style of beer, and maybe it doesn't need to be English, but more ester driven, more characterful.
Yeah, and you mentioned to me, you said you felt like it was a normal IPA trying to be a New England IPA, and I was wondering if you could just for the listeners out there expand on that. What do you mean by a normal IPA trying to be a New England IPA? What sorts of characteristics did you pick up on? Because if you've taken the yeast out of the equation, what are these other things that contribute to the New England IPA being a New England IPA? Yeah,
and you're saying that the Chico fermented version of this beer,
right.
And that's what it felt like, an imposter in many ways. I did all of these other things that were very, with the exception of maybe not including enough flaked oats, which I think that was a function of the fact that I ran out of flaked oats. But but everything else, I did the biotransformation dry hop, I did all this stuff, but it just felt too clean. I don't think it was I don't think it was an FG difference thing. Maybe it was, but it had that a little bit crisper, thinner, less, the word you use is pillowy. I use thick, viscous mouthfeel that I expect from a New England IPA.
It's almost kind of like a Guinness, I think of Guinness as a lighter, pillowy stout in my mind. I don't know. But I bring that up because I tried making just a sort of a short and shoddy style New England IPA one afternoon when I was brewing. It was back in June, and I had a slurry of 090 from White Labs, and so I used that because I know everybody at Brewlosophy always used to chime about 090 being a go-to yeast. I know it's one of Ray's favorites.
Oh, it's one of my faves too.
Yeah, and so I tried using that in a New England IPA, and I felt like there was a distinct difference between that beer and the other New England IPAs that I made, and it's just like you described, and that's why I brought it up, is it felt like a normal IPA that was trying so hard to be a New England IPA, but it was missing that that fruity, like those fruity esters and almost a little bit of the mouthfeel. It did taste cleaner, and I want to say even more crisp than I get from a London 3, which, it's a one-off batch, but one-off batches, lots of them is how we build off and kind of create these impressions. So
yeah. Well, and those slight differences are how you create new styles. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And honestly, hey, if you're making New England IPA and you want to call it New England IPA, even though you're fermenting it with US-05, more power to you. Do it. Who cares? I just think, I don't get dogmatic about this, but for me, I guess the way I should be spinning it is if I'm going to drink a New England IPA, I have certain expectations, that it fits within these parameters. And to me, it really does seem like, and I could be talking out of my butt here, but it really does seem like yeast plays a role in the creation of what I believe New England IPA to be. I am super interested in experimenting with other English types of yeast. I don't know if I want to be the one to brew 10 gallons of this beer, but it would be interesting to me. I've never seen, I'm sure people have done it. If you've done it, let us know. I'm sure people have fermented New England IPA with something like, Imperial's Pub Ale. That's the fuller strain. Somebody's had to have done that. I know that people are making West Coast IPA with it. I've done it many times. It works fantastic, but that is a very Englishy strain, that produces, some esters that everyone loves, really. Another common one that I've seen a lot of people use is the Whitbread Dry, which I believe is Imperial's House. That's WLP 007. That's another English strain that some people say is a little bit similar to the fuller strain, but more attenuative. That's another one that I know that people are playing around with. Another thing that would be interesting to me that this has gotten me onto, it would. You're
just making a list of experiments.
I know.
I'm gonna have to do here over the next year.
Well, and I'll be honest. What I'm hoping for is that some listener out there is like, "Oh, I've compared these two," and writes in and gives us some info. But what if you brew like a traditionally English style beer, so say like an English bitter, and you do a comparison of Chico versus 1318 or whatever in that style? Would we be able to tell the difference? I would suspect that you probably could, but who knows?
I mean, I think we've gone through a lot of different things, and you and I have talked a lot about New England IPA. It seems like we do it about every time I'm on the podcast. But I think using an English style yeast. We've talked about water, being pretty important. We've talked about adjuncts, oats, wheat being maybe perhaps not as important as was once thought. But I think, we talked about, you brought up the idea of a normal IPA trying to be a New England IPA, and it gets me thinking as to, okay, well, what is a New England IPA? What makes it that?
Yeah.
Because, the BJCP is reworking it into a category, or I don't know if they already have at this point.
I think it's specialty IPA right now. It fits under like 21A or something like the 21B is specialty IPA. But yeah,
right. So in my mind, it gets me thinking like, okay, the things that are making it up in my mind are high hopping but low bitterness. Our water ratio, and then some expressive English style yeast where you're getting more of these fruity esters.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, if anyone out there has messed around with different yeast strains in New England IPA, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to shoot us an email, feedback@brewlosophy.com. That's all the time we've got for this show. I don't have anything else to talk about in terms of yeast and New England IPA. Brian?
No, did you want to talk a little bit more about haze?
No. So to read more about the experiments that we talked about in this episode, as well as all the other stuff that we're up to, you can head over to brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.